we've got some people still joining us, but we always like to start things on time. So if we'll kick off now, and then as other people join us, they can pick it up. I guess first of all, if I can, I'll introduce myself. My name's Lee Panglia, and I head up the CIPD in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our event this afternoon on making work better for older workers. I guess if I can just start by just a wee practical thing, you all have control over your own cameras and your own microphones. So while we are going, when our speakers are presenting, if you could just keep yourself on mute, please. I think all of you are now. So if you can do that, that would be great. So as I said, welcome to the session this afternoon. Scotland's population and our workforce is ageing. Our purpose at CIPD is to champion better work and working lives, and we're committed not only to the removal of age discrimination in the workplace, but supporting our members in the people profession in general to recognise the benefits of age-inclusive people management practice, both to individuals and to organisations. You'll be aware as the professional body that we produce lots of practical guidance for our members to support them make those positive changes in the workplace. And this guidance is evidence-based. It draws on not only CIPD's insight and research into the labour market, but it draws on insight and research and evidence from our strategic partners, like our colleagues who are in the discussion today. So I'm delighted to introduce and welcome our speakers today. We have 4 contributors to the discussion. My colleague Marek Zemanik, who is our Senior Public Policy Advisor for the CIPD in Scotland and Northern Ireland. We then have Wendy Loretto, who is Dean of the University of Edinburgh Business School, and joined by her colleague Laura Airey, who is Senior Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh Business School. And last but not least, we have Beth, who is a social researcher with the Fair Work Convention. So, over our discussion today, over lunchtime, we'll explore the research and the findings carried out by 2 reports. A report by the CIPD, by Marek himself, and the Fair Work Convention. So those are 2 recently published reports which seek to give us a better understanding of older workers in Scotland, their experiences, their preferences, and the different considerations that emerge as people get older. These reports will then be supplemented, added to by qualitative research that Wendy and Laura from the University of Edinburgh Business School have undertaken. We do hope this session will give you, our members, and also some non-members on the call too, will improve your understanding of older workers, who we generally define as those aged 50 plus, by the way, their experiences, their preferences and considerations, so which will enable us, I guess, to create better jobs and more fulfilling working lives. So before I pass on to the speakers, can I just remind you to keep yourself on mute? We will have lots of time for questions at the end, so if you want to post them in the chat, or you can ask them of the presenters later, and if you would like to ask a question directly, then raise your hand and we'll invite you to speak. So thank you for joining us again. I hope you enjoy the session. We have an hour and a half for this, and I will now pass over to Marek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, and of course, thank you all very much for joining us this lunchtime. I'm the first one to speak. Let me just start by sharing my screen for this presentation. Hopefully that's all going to work as intended. Here we go. I'm hoping everybody can see that. If I'm not hearing any complaints, I'll just keep going. Excellent. So my job today is to give a bit of an overview of, first of all, why we're talking about the topic, and then give you a bit of a rundown of this report that we released in March 2022, which sort of seeks to look at official data, official statistics, and see what sort of conclusions we can draw from the numbers, and what it sort of teaches us about the preferences of older workers. If I just start by a bit of a sort of scene setting, why are we even talking about older workers today in the first place? Well, I think there's probably a bit of a narrative shift happening recently. There certainly has been a bit more exposure in the media of the topic, talking about the importance of older workers and their preferences. There's a lot more interest in the topic more generally, as well as evidenced by this webinar, which is one of the most subscribed ones that we've had in the last few years, actually. Now, why is that? Now, some of that is down to the sort of long-term trends that have been discussed for quite some time. Chief amongst them, of course, our aging workforce, not just in Scotland, but of course, UK-wide as well. And there's a very clear sort of public policy element there as well in relation to tax revenue and spending on public services, pensions, etc., etc. But recently, there's also been more of an interest in talking about job quality and employee well-being, and how that impacts on things like individual productivity as well, of course. And that requires a bit of a focus on individual employee preferences as well. And older workers, of course, are a significant segment of that workforce. And last but not least, Industry 4.0 and the changes brought about by automation and AI and machine learning and all that sort of stuff, and how that relates to things like lifelong learning, for example. These are all topics that have been under discussion for, I want to say, at least 5 to 10 years or so. But there's some more recent trends, of course, as well, that have caused this topic to rise up the agenda a little bit more. Of course, chief amongst them is one of the most significant crises that any of us remember, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the impacts of the pandemic that is just being explored just now is the rise, quite significant rise, in the percentage of older workers who class themselves as economically inactive. So that's not people who are unemployed or employed, but they are simply out of the labor market altogether. That can be for various reasons. It can be for ill health, for example. It can be because of early retirement, which could be linked to perhaps the pandemic changing certain individual preferences of some of these workers. But it is certainly something that needs to be explored a lot more. But even more recently than the pandemic, of course, as we started emerging from the pandemic, many employers across many industries started reporting significant skills and labor shortages, of course, and there's a lot more interest in trying to expand an employer's pool of labor from which to recruit. Indeed, that may well be why many of you are on this call, to try and find out a little bit more about the preferences of older workers. Now, even more recently than the skills and labor shortages we've seen post-COVID, the impact of the cost of living crisis and the sort of looming recession may well have some sort of an impact on older workers as well. What I mean by that is, if the cost of living increases start biting, as it seems that they certainly will, it may well result in some economically inactive older workers to try and come back into the labor market and look for employment to try and supplement their income. So all of these long-term and sort of more short and more recent trends are, I think, some of the reasons why we are talking about older workers in the first place. Now, what I'll be talking about today is a CIPD report. It's actually a couple of reports that we published in March 2022. One was a UK-wide one, and there was a Scottish version of the report, which I wrote as well. And as I said in the beginning, it's very much based on an analysis of official labor statistics from the ONS, either the labor force survey or the annual population survey, And what I'm going to try and do today is try and show you the Scottish data where possible. There's quite a lot of UK numbers as well, where the samples for Scotland are a bit too small. There's quite a lot of graphs, but mostly very interesting graphs. You'll be pleased to hear. But there's plenty more in the report itself that you can find on our website very easily. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the sort of who, how, and where of all the workers, how many there are, where do they work, in the sort of industries, what sort of skills and qualifications they have. I'll look a little bit at employment patterns, patterns of flexible working, pre-pandemic as well, incidentally. Look at under and overemployment as well. Look at career progression and skill development opportunities and what all the workers feel about those things, like career advancement or lifelong learning. And then, of course, last but not least, look a bit about long-term health and disability and the sort of relationship between age and certain health conditions. Now, I already mentioned, and Lee mentioned, the Scotland's ageing population as well. I think it's important for a sort of scene setter just to sort of show what we really are talking about. This is the latest projections from National Records of Scotland, from the sort of population estimates, and they show you quite nicely how these things are projected to change. You see the number of children in Scotland projected to fall by 22% by 2045, whereas the number of people aged 65 plus is projected to grow by nearly 30%, which then actually means, of course, that the ratio between people of working age and people of pension age worsens, and that has an impact on tax revenues and, of course, other knock-on impacts on public services and the public spending that's required for example, the health service or social care services, etc., etc. This is why it's so important to talk about this from a public policy level as well. Most of all today, I'll be talking about it from an employer level, however. And I think the thing that I would want to emphasize to begin with is that we are talking about a significant chunk of Scotland's workforce. Even today, so this is even before the aging population trends start accelerating over the next few years. Even today, we have 852,000 older workers. Now, as Lee says, that's usually categorized as those aged 50 plus. But even looking at those past retirement age, we've got over 90,000 workers that are 65 and older. So that's altogether about a third of Scotland's workforce, and it's really imperative that we understand this segment of the population. Now, the first really big graph that I'm going to show you is probably the most complicated one, but let me just talk you through it. This is a breakdown of economic activity across various age groups. And I think it's a sort of nice illustration of the sort of employees' life cycle. I'm going to turn this laser thing on, which hopefully works. And you see that levels of employment slowly increase here as you reach adulthood, and then throughout the life cycle, throughout the working life, and they start dropping off a little bit post 50, 55, etc. The other thing to look at here, for example, is levels of self-employment, which are virtually non-existent here, but then they start rising up a little bit and start increasing, especially for older workers there as well. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, naturally, of course, your student percentage much higher here at the for the younger chunks of the population, virtually disappear here over the age of 40, 45, etc. Retirement, obviously, very, very big here, 65 plus, but some signs of earlier retirement here as well. And the other thing I was going to highlight is the inactivity levels because of health conditions or disability, relatively steady here up until the sort of age of 40 plus, where it starts increasing a bit further as well. Now, what we really will be focusing on today, and I mentioned this economic inactivity, is sort of this group of people here, which is those who are economically inactive for a variety of reasons. Now, we also, official statistics also ask about whether these people would like, some of these people would like to work, some of them are just inactive because they don't want to work. And actually, official estimates show that you've got still about maybe 100,000 or so, 100,000 people in Scotland who are aged 50 plus who would like to work, but cannot work for a variety of reasons. Now that potentially could make a real significant contribution to Scotland's workforce, but it's important to understand the reasons for why they are not able to do so, or why they feel they're not able to do so. Now, where do older people work? This is a nice breakdown of the sort of ages by industry in Scotland. You will immediately see that there's quite significant differences between various industries. Some industries here are very much bottom heavy. So, for example, here we look at hospitality, where average age is about 35. Only about a fifth of workers here are aged 50 plus. And you've got other industries which are very much top heavy. So your agriculture, for example, here, average age is 48. Over half of them are over 50. It's probably important that we look at this topic through an industry lens as well, because there may well be some cross-learning that we can take from this. Why are certain industries struggling to attract younger workers? Why are others struggling to attract older workers? What makes some industries more attractive to older workers, etc., etc. The last graph I'm going to show you in this section is just this one, something I'm going to come back to a little bit later on, which is a sort of breakdown of formal qualifications by age. And you can see, and this is very much a reflection of the focus on qualification sort of over the last sort of 20-25 years or so, where those aged, let's say, under 55 are much less likely to have sort of formal qualifications than younger workers, with sort of obvious impacts for things like recruitment. But I'm going to come back to that later on. Now, I mentioned I was going to talk about employment patterns a little bit, and one of the things that I already highlighted was self-employment. Older workers have much higher rates of self-employment. Now, that is linked to mostly flexibility over the sort of hours that you work, but also to things like job autonomy, which is an important part of job quality. But there's also much higher rates of part-time working that you will find amongst older workers. Now, some of that is linked to this concept of semi-retirement, where you sort of basically trade your full-time pay for better work-life balance, but also linked to adult caring responsibilities, where older workers tend to reduce their hours so they can care for elderly parents or other relatives. It doesn't actually receive as much public policy focus as it probably should. But working from home is another one, actually. And if you look at the pre-pandemic trends, obviously things will have shifted over the last 2.5 years, but pre-pandemic trends, you will see very much higher rates of home working for older workers than for younger workers. And this actually is also linked to things like lower commuting times as well, which shows that older workers are much less likely to commute for long amounts of time per day. Now, the pandemic here presents an opportunity as sort of working from home and hybrid ways of working become a lot more normal. Surely this should mean that many jobs are a lot more attractive for older workers as well. With an increased focus on flexibility, we may be able to accommodate these preferences a bit better. But of course, it's not just about home working. Home working is only one kind of flexible working. We should be talking about compressed hours, reduced hours as well, job sharing, and other more creative types of flexible working as well. A couple of graphs here just to basically couple of graphs to, if we can, getting somebody on the call contributing. Okay, here we go. A couple of graphs here just to sort of highlight, underline what I've just shown you, which is the high rates of part-time working and the sort of home working there as well. I think it sort of illustrates those differences by age quite nicely here. Now, this is probably one of my favorite graphs in the report, which looks at the sort of underemployment and over-employment. This sort of asks people whether they would like to work more hours or few hours, whether they're satisfied with their hours. But crucially, it makes a link to earnings as well. So two things that I will highlight here. One is that the age group of 50 to 64 has the sort of lowest satisfaction with their hours, not by a huge margin, but still it is the lowest satisfaction there. But the really interesting thing is this, which is around 14% of both those 50 to 64 and those 65 and over would be looking for few hours and quite happy to take a pay cut there as well, which to me shows very clearly that there is unmet demand out there amongst all the workers for some sort of these sort of reduced hours a reduction in pay. Now on career progression, we know from all our sort of job quality research as well and conversations that we've had with people like you as well, is that career progression opportunities and skill development opportunities are increasingly important for both retention, but also for recruitment. Job applicants no longer just ask about salary levels and working hours, but they look at other sort of externalities like this as well. And this is where there's a clear gap that comes up. Older workers are much less likely to say that they have these opportunities to both progress in their career or to develop their skills. Now, it may well be that for some, that's just a simply reflection of their stage of their careers, and they're not really looking for anything more. But I think it's very important that employers avoid assumptions when it comes to this, and may well be that some older workers are still looking to progress their careers slightly further. Now, I mentioned the qualifications piece, and I think it's important we emphasize that qualifications are not always a direct proxy for skills, and we know that older workers are much less likely to apply for roles where there are some qualifications, especially degree qualification requirements. So this is the sort of thing that discourages older workers who may well have the skill set that you need from applying for roles. On skill development, again, older workers are much less likely to participate in formal training, off-the-job training. And again, it's important to avoid assumptions that this is not something maybe that this employee would be interested in taking part in. And of course, there's a public policy dimension there as well for lifelong learning and the provision of skills development for older workers, which is still very much lacking both in Scotland and sort of UK-wide as well. So these graphs here are just to sort of highlight what I've just said. You see the sort of percentages of workers who disagree with the statement that my job offers good opportunities for career progression steadily increases as you go up the sort of age range up to the top there. And on skills development, it's the sort of exact opposite there, whether somebody has attended off the job training in the past 4 weeks. You see that sort of stays relatively steady here up until the age of 55. It sort of drops off a little bit further. Now, last but not least, health and disability. Now, unsurprising, there's a very clear link in health conditions and disability status and age, obviously, for some workers, these will limit the amount of work that they can do. If you want to quantify that, over a quarter of those age, sort of 60 to 64, who are looking for work, say that this limits the amount or kind of work that they can do. And about a fifth of those aged 50 plus say the same thing. So again, this really highlights the importance of employer interventions when it comes to trying to make trying to accommodate employees' conditions and preferences as well. Okay, that was a very quick sort of whistle-stop tour of the report. There's a lot more stuff in there, but some of the sort of I guess key conclusions that we took away from all these numbers that we crunched. First and foremost, I'll emphasize again, we're talking about a third of the workforce about to get even bigger. It is very, very important that we understand their preferences and their sort of experiences in work. It's important for employers. It's important for policymakers. That's obviously very important for employees themselves. Now we see that the pandemic has had an impact by pushing some of these workers out of the labor market, but it may well be that the cost of living crisis pulls them back in. Now, the three areas that I will highlight, and it's actually three areas that Laura and Wendy will be speaking about as well. Flexibility and flexible work. Very clearly, there's an unmet demand amongst all the workers for reduced hours as well. Working from home is very much something that is sought by all the workers as well. So the pandemic and the new ways of working offer an opportunity there. Two, on career development and skills, I'll just repeat again, avoiding assumptions on both of these is very, very important, because there will be big chunks of employees who are looking to develop their skills further, even at an advanced stage, and develop their careers further as well. Now this has impact on both recruitment when it comes to qualifications, as I mentioned, but also retention, making sure that we keep employees in jobs as long as they want to work for. And on health and well-being, of course, the role of the employer there is key. And I think the thing that we emphasize in the report is that this is not just about focusing on health for all the workers. Focusing on the health and well-being of your entire workforce throughout the age ranges, then also means that some of the problems later on in working lives can be avoided or mitigated a bit easier. So it's not just about focusing on that one group of workers. Ultimately, what we're trying to achieve is that those who do want to work and do want to continue to work should be able to do so. And that's what we're hoping that this research can contribute to, at least a little bit. Now, that's the end of my presentation. I will now invite Laura, Airey, and Wendy Loretto from University of Edinburgh Business School to sort of bring this to life a little bit with some qualitative research that they have been doing, and see how it complements these boring statistics. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Marek. Can I just now start to share my screen, please?
Thanks very much, Marek. Introduce myself. I'm Wendy Loretto and Laura, and I will be doing a double act on this, Marek, that if everybody could present stats as interestingly as you could, I think there'd be a lot more stats converts. That was really, really interesting. So well, what Laura and I are going to do, and welcome and hello everybody, is going to maybe give a little bit more insight into the whys, some of the whys behind what Marek has shown us. And we're going to talk from a body of work that we're doing. And as Marek said, we're going to mirror the structure of his presentation, but we're going to particularly focus the presentation on health. So Laura, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. Thank you. So this just slide gives an oversight of the various projects that we're going to be drawing from. And there's quite a bit of detail here, but what I wanted to highlight was there's the names of the project in that first column. That's of less interest to you here, but the times that this has been done. So we've really drawing on a body of work that started in the middle of the last decade. The work has covered interviews in all the sectors that you see, different sectors and different projects. It is mainly focused on older people in employment, but the Scottish Government, the second of those two projects there, actually focused on, there were some unemployed and some retired older people as well. But mainly it's been people over 50 in employment throughout a whole range of sectors. The numbers of interviews you can see have varied across the project, but typically more than 100. The final column is the number of interviews that we've done with what we're calling expert people. So those may be occupational health specialists, pensions, HR specialists, and trade unions as well. So, and one of our projects, the DAISY project, the studies were replicated in different countries as well. We've got links at the very end of the presentation to all of these projects, and if you do want to know more about any of them, please do contact us. So, Laura, if you could move to the next slide. I'm just going to talk through the first two themes fairly briefly and then give plenty of time for Laura to come in on health. So in terms of flexible working, what we're finding, excuse me, I should say a real consensus of finding across all the projects. And when we talk to employers, pretty much unanimously, employers say, oh yes, we offer flexible working. And that's a way that, you know, we see as attractive for retaining the over 50s. And that would completely, you know, align to Marek's finding. But when then we talk to employees, and pretty much every study that we've done, there is a real lack of employees aware that they've got these options. And that lack of awareness is more marked in the over 50s than it is in other age groups. So they simply don't know what employers offer, or indeed feel, in my second bullet point there, they have a hesitation about asking. And what was coming through very strongly from us from a couple of our projects is that hesitation came through much more amongst women. So women were already, say, more likely to work part-time. Maybe they've been working part-time for all or a large part of their career, and felt that they couldn't then ask their employer if they wanted, say, to reduce their hours a bit further, or to compress their hours, or do a different form of working. And in some cases, we rather grandly call this a myth of empowerment, that there's almost an assumption that people know that there's awareness of what their rights are and feel empowered that they can ask for this. But we were finding that very much this was mixed, and for many employees, particularly women working in lower level jobs, they felt they couldn't ask their employers. We heard things like, my employer's already doing me a favour by letting me work part-time. I can't ask for any further flexibility. So I think in terms of going back to Marek's, one of our calls is to, you know, to really not assume that your employees know what you can offer, and to really press this. Another thing that we found in terms of flexibility, there's very often a mismatch between the employer needs and the employee wishes. And you know, one particular study that we did, you know, we talked about the wee part-time job. So there was almost like fantasy jobs that some older workers feel they could do, which may not match with the needs of the employers. You know, we know, I mean, I'm a manager myself in a unit of 250 employees, that, you know, you've got to get the jobs done and the jobs covered. And somebody coming in and saying, well, you know, I would like to work perhaps, you know, 3 hours every day, but not over lunch times, and, you know, certain things, we may not be able to accommodate that. So I think that is a challenge thrown out, you know, to actually how you align what the employer needs and what the employee can do and wishes to do in terms of flexibility. I think a key finding from our work has been to support what Marek just said about self-employed. Flexibility is a key traction for those who've become self-employed. And here, the older workers that we've been talking to have been sacrificing financial stability, they've been and financial well-being, but in order to get that flexibility, and quite often that flexibility that helps them meet caring needs and also you know, health needs as well, as Laura will talk about. So I think being aware that flexible working is a very real option, sorry, self-employment is a very real option to give the flexibility that older workers needs is important if employers want to say, well, actually, we want to retain you and stop you leaving us to become self-employed. Home working is really interesting, and you know, thinking again what Marek was saying about a real attraction for older workers, I think we have to be careful about that. we don't yet know, for any of us, we don't yet know the longer term, impacts of home working. But what we're seeing amongst some of the people we've been interviewing in our latest project is that there may be a limit to the attractiveness. That yes, and again, Laura will talk about in a moment the benefits to people's health of being able to work at home in some cases, but the isolation and social isolation is becoming an issue for at least some older workers. And I think we will have to keep our eyes very closely on hybrid and home working as we go forward into the next few months and indeed years. Can I move to the next slide, Laura? Thanks. Thank you. So the second category that Marek talked about was career progression and training. And I think here, what we're starting to see over the last 5 years or so are some positive examples of companies adjusting training and employers more generally adjusting training methods to the needs and preferences of older age groups. So this may be, for example, having different training methods, not assuming that one training method, fits all. And I think here, what we are seeing is that not assuming that all training has to be computer based, that actually doing training in a different variety of formats may appeal to older age groups. Quite frankly, I think it may appeal to different needs of individuals at different ages. It's not necessarily age dependent. So I think organisations that have introduced different types of training methods have seen a benefit for their whole workforce, not just their older age group. But certainly we have seen some positive examples. Also on the positive side, opportunities associated with mentoring. So particularly, people who are nearing the end of their career, mentoring mid-career and early career colleagues, but also reverse mentoring. So we've heard some very nice examples of younger employees mentoring older employees, specifically for example, introduction of new technologies. And those have been seen as a real sort of way of enriching the job experience of not just older workers, but indeed the whole workforce. So it's great that these are these positives, but I have to say they are far outweighed by the negatives. And I think, as Marek showed from his statistics, that there is a real sort of gap here, and older workers being overlooked in progression and training. And I think that the 2 reasons that I want to highlight briefly to you that we've been finding from our research is that the lack of employer insight into the needs of older workers is a real issue. And I think it arises actually from a good place. The number of employers that we've spoken to, and this has actually been in the case in that study that's gone across other countries, is that employers say, we don't want to be guilty of discrimination. We don't want to be age discrimination, so we treat everybody the same. Now, that's a very positive place that's coming from. But the actual impact that has is that it means that older workers get ignored. So, we were hearing from employers who said, we don't talk about retirement anymore. We don't have retirement conversations because that could be seen to be ageist. At what age, do you actually start to talk about possible retirement to somebody? You can't do that now because that could be seen to be ageist. But what they did was nothing. So from the employee point of view, the employee would say, nobody talks to me. Nobody talks to me about what I want, what I might need, what I can do. I just get ignored. So that kind of mismatch between employers saying, well, we're not doing it because we don't want to be ageist, and employees just feeling they're ignored, I think is one that is really a challenge for us all to overcome. And not to be afraid of having those conversations, because they're not discriminatory to have conversations. Ultimately, if we think about, I'm quite amused by the definition of older worker. I think as many people are, older worker starts at 50 and then it goes to when? We've got people in employment in their 80s and beyond. It's such a huge stage of life, isn't it? And you wouldn't think about, not talking to a 20-year-old about potentially the next 10, 15, 20 years of their employment. So why should we be afraid of talking to older people? I think another issue that's really strong that comes up from our research is that it's not just an employer oversight that leads to these barriers, but also from what we've called internalized ageism. And that's the older workers themselves saying, I'm too old to do something, or I'm too old to learn this technology, I'm too old, or an employer wouldn't want to be invest in me because I'm too old. Or frequently, and again, we're hearing this more from women in research than we're hearing from men, it's not right to invest in me. I need to move on to make way for a younger worker. And that pitching, I think that the media has been quite guilty of saying that actually older workers should move on and make way for younger workers, and our attention to younger workers has actually been quite damaging. As Marek's statistics showed, we need workers of every age, and it's not pitching older versus younger. And I think that, you know, so overcoming these barriers that arise from, say, what people internalize is really important too. So I'm going to hand on to Laura now, who's going to pick up to say quite a bit more about health.
Thanks, Wendy. So I just want to start off by saying, why does health and wellbeing matter? Well, as Marek has already alluded to, older workers aged 50 and over, form a significant proportion, a third of the Scottish workforce. And we already know that health problems are one of the main reasons why people leave work before state pension age. And paradoxically, those in the poorest health are often those least able to afford to retire early. And so it's really critical, as Marek said, the role of the employer to ensure that the right workplace supports are in place in order to enable older workers to sustain employment even if they have health problems. So in light of this, it's really important to deepen our understanding of how work, health and well-being are intertwined in older workers' everyday lives. And it's important also to understand that the relationship between health and work goes both ways. So we know that people's health can impact on their ability to do their jobs, but also things like job design, the work environment can have an impact upon people's ability to do their job because it affects their health. So I want to look at that two-way relationship a little bit more now and think about ways in which work impacts on people's health and older workers in particular. I'm going to draw on some data from previous studies that we've done, which show that the sorts of health issues that arise from job design can vary across different sectors and job types. And to give you an example of that, I want to talk briefly about shift work. We've interviewed a large number of shift workers working in different sectors and occupations in previous studies. And those participants have told us that as they have grown older, engaging in shift work has impacted upon their health in a range of ways, often via various what we call lifestyle and behavioural factors. So, for example, we know that shift work can disrupt older workers' sleep patterns. It can lead to poorer eating habits if workers can't have regular meals at regular meal times. Shift work often means that people have fewer opportunities to exercise. So, for example, if they're working during the night and sleeping during the day, they may not have opportunities to get outdoors when they're not working, or to get to the gym or what have you at antisocial times. And we also know that heavy manual work can have a cumulative impact on physical health over time, whether or not people are working shifts. But for example, nurses that we've interviewed have often talked about the strain on their body, the wear and tear that accumulates over the course of their lifetimes via lifting patients, for example, as part of their work. So over time, as people age, shift work can increasingly impact upon people's experiences of their own health and well-being. In different sectors, for example, jobs and occupations that are much more desk-based, workers tend to report other issues, other ways in which work impacts upon their health and well-being. So, for example, we have many participants talking about how the stress associated with high workloads and the always-on culture impacts upon their mental health, their sense of well-being. And older workers have also told us about the impact that sedentary work associated with sitting at their desk for long hours has upon a range of different elements of their health and well-being, contributing to a range of acute and chronic health issues. Now, we've already mentioned, Wendy's mentioned, Marek has mentioned the shift to working from home during the pandemic. And as Wendy alluded to, amongst the participants that we have spoken to in the last couple of years, the shift to working from home has had both benefits for older workers' health and well-being, but there have been some cons to that as well. But in terms of the benefits, many older workers that we spoke to talked about the greater flexibility that they've had once they've been working from home. And Marek mentioned commuting being an issue. Pre-pandemic, commuting was a real issue amongst many people that we worked work that we talked to in the course of our research, commuting seems to really impact upon the experience of day-to-day life, and our participants talked about how that had got worse as they'd grown older. And by contrast, when we've been interviewing people more recently, lots of people have really appreciated the extra time in their day that not having to commute has afforded them, and that's given them the opportunity to engage in activities that they consider to be health promoting, whether that's sleeping in for a bit longer in the mornings, or being able to take a walk in the middle of the day, or engage in other forms of exercise when it suits them. So the greater flexibility and autonomy that working from home can bring can be a real positive for older workers in terms of their health and well-being. On the downside, we have also found, as Wendy has mentioned, that some older workers found that actually it's pretty lonely working from home, and they missed the camaraderie and the exchange in face-to-face interactions with their colleagues, and that impacted upon their sense of well-being. And as this quote that's on the screen shows, other older workers we spoke to felt that once they were working from home, they were chained to their desk from sort of 7 in the morning till maybe 8 or 9 o'clock at night. They weren't getting up, they weren't moving around, and this was having an impact in terms of aches and pains, in addition just to the general intensification of work. So that's two different ways in which work design and features of work itself can impact upon health and well-being. But I want to move now to talk about the current project that we're working on that's called Supporting Healthy Aging at Work. And the aim of this project is to design innovative workplace health interventions to support the health and well-being of older workers. And just to recap on the information that Wendy had on a prior screen, we've interviewed 146 workers aged 50 and over, working in 3 case study organisations, as well as a sample of self-employed workers. And in addition to that, we also conducted a survey of 61 additional workers within those organisations. Now, in this project, we have been very interested in anything health and wellbeing related that employees wanted to talk to us about. If it mattered to them, it matters to us. But in particular, we've been really interested in what we've called hidden health issues that tend to be overlooked in regular workplace health interventions, which tend to focus a lot on lifestyle behaviours such as diet, exercise, smoking and alcohol consumption. So we've wanted to focus on health issues that don't get talked about as often as issues such as chronic health problems, musculoskeletal issues and lifestyle associated issues. So we've been particularly asking people about menopause, about cognitive decline, staying sharp as you grow older, about financial well-being and about the health needs of informal carers. Now, we have a wealth of data on all of those topics, in particular on menopause, but I expect that Beth is going to talk about that in her presentation later on. So I want to talk very briefly now about one particular hidden health issue that has emerged very strongly in this project, which we weren't originally specifically focusing on, and that is on sleep disruption. Now, this was mentioned by around 3/4 of our participants, both men and women, so it's an absolutely huge issue, but one which isn't much discussed in discussions of workplace health and wellbeing. Amongst our sample of participants in the SURE study, people identified many different reasons why they felt their sleep was being disrupted and increasingly disrupted as they grew older. This was very much an issue which people felt had developed in recent years and as they grew older was becoming more and more of an issue for their health. Now, aside from just regular insomnia, of which people couldn't necessarily link to any particular issue going on in their lives, we had a range of different reasons why people's sleep was being disrupted. Now, menopause emerged unsurprisingly as a really strong underlying cause amongst women for sleep disruption. As you'll see from the quote up here, lots of women were expressed having night sweats, hot flushes during the night, many times a night, and with their covers off and covers on, and this really impacting on the quality of sleep they were able to have. But as you can see, there were a range of other things that both men and women also experienced which disrupted their sleep. Pain, stress, either relating from things going on in their home lives, family relationships, money worries, or stress associated with their work might keep them awake at night. And a very common underlying cause of sleep disruption was people saying they needed to use the bathroom during the night in a way that hadn't been the case in their younger years, but as they grew older, both men and women talked about needing to get up to go to the loo in the middle of the night. And for virtually all of these participants, sleep disruption had a real impact upon their work performance during the day, struggling to stay awake, struggling to get out of bed in the morning in the first place. So physical tiredness, but also this had a real impact on their cognition, on their memory, on their ability to focus on tasks, on their concentration. But this was also an issue that really was sort of hidden, that they didn't necessarily feel able to talk about at work. So I want to move on now, because that links to a question that's been really interesting emerging from our data. Who is responsible for older workers' health and well-being? Well, despite evidence that we know that working conditions can influence health, many of our research participants reported a very strong sense of personal responsibility for their health. It was their issue. If they had health problems, it was up to them to deal with it. And people were unwilling, in many cases, to disclose health problems to their colleagues or to their line managers. And in digging a little bit deeper into our data, we think that there's a number of reasons for this, which we've kind of encapsulated under the term of psychological safety. Many participants in our study feared that there would be negative repercussions for them if they told their line manager or co-workers that they had particular health issues. They were worried about being stigmatized. They were worried if they worked with younger line managers or younger colleagues that their health problems would be linked to their age and that they would be less valued because they were expressing that they were struggling with particular health issues. And even if participants were willing to disclose their health issues, many employees found it hard to imagine how their employer could actually help them. So, for example, in the case of sleep issues, people say, well, what's my work got to do with my sleep? What are they going to do about it? But what we know is that, as Wendy and Marek have alluded to around flexible work options, there are in fact things that employers could do to support their employees who are maybe having sleep issues, in terms of arranging later start times, for example, or giving them time off in the afternoon to have a nap if they needed that. So there are things that we need to sort of further explore, because of course, if older workers experience health problems that they don't feel they can disclose to their employers, but those health problems impinge upon their ability to conduct their work and maybe even push them out of the labour market, then organisations are at real risk of losing workers who are maybe highly valued for their expertise and their experience. And of course, it's not necessarily good for older workers themselves to have to leave work because of their health problems. So very quickly, because I know we're running short of time and I need to allow Beth time to talk, how can organisations support healthy ageing at work? As I've already alluded to, the relationship between employees and their line managers are key. So we would suggest enhanced training for line managers so that they're better equipped to support employee well-being, so that they're really on top of knowing what sickness policies are, what well-being supports are in place, how they can offer appropriate support to their employees, and linked to that, organisational culture, taking steps to improve psychological safety so that employees feel like they can talk to their line managers. And this is all about better communication between management and staff so that people feel safe and welcomed to talk about the issues that are impacting upon day-to-day life. I've already talked about flexible work options, so I'm not going to say more on that. But I think it's really important not to just focus on individual lifestyle behaviours in terms of workplace health interventions, but to consider job design as well. Now, in all of this, my final point is to say that we have noticed between our different organisations, they have different models of how they provide employee support. So in some organisations, it's very much a self-service sort of model where their support is out there, but employees have to access that themselves. In other organisations, there's perhaps a more interventionist model of support where employers are much more proactive in providing support for older workers' health and well-being. And we would suggest that there's a fine line in terms of getting the balance right there. But I'm not going to say any more because what I want to do now is hand over to Beth. I have a slide here, but I'm going to hurry on, and you're very welcome to email us if you would like these slides later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Laura. I'm just going to bring my slides up now. So I hope everyone can see those. So yeah, it's brilliant to be here, and actually just reflecting on what's been said already from Marek and Wendy and Laura. It's great just to see the overlap and the same messages coming up that we can really sort of take forward here. So I'm here to talk on behalf of the Fair Work Convention about a piece of research that we commissioned and that was undertaken by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. It ties in, as I said, so closely with the research we've heard before, but took a very particular focus on women over 50, but also trying to look specifically to what workplace practices, what workplace experiences and workplace practices were meaning for that group of women. So for those who don't know, the Fair Work Convention is an independent body in Scotland. I sit as part of the Secretariat to the convention within Scottish Government, but the convention itself is independent and brings together employers, trade unions, workers and academics to really try and push the Fair Work agenda forwards in Scotland. Got various roles within government in terms of lobbying, for instance, and promoting fair work. And we work around 5 dimensions that are presented on the screen here. So effective voice, fulfilment, opportunity, security and respect. I could talk for ages about all of these dimensions, but we haven't got time for that today. So I hope people have got some awareness of fair work, but if not, please do visit our website. So we all have different experiences of fair work within our workplaces, and as part of the Fair Work Convention's role, we investigate what those experiences are, either by sector, for instance, or by different demographics. So in this case, as I said, we're interested in women over 50, having recognised that the gender pay gap is falling most slowly for this group of women. So what is it? Why is this so persistent for over 50s? And we know some of that's a legacy impact. You know, when we first set out to do this piece of research, doing the literature and talking to people, obviously the first thing that comes up in conversation is, isn't this an impact of women earlier in their careers having children, and what's that sort of longer term impact? So there's definitely impacts coming from earlier in career. But we were also interested to understand where there were current workplace practices that were still hindering pay and progression. So why is this persistence of inequality so apparent still? So, as I said, we awarded the work to NISA through an open competition, and we already knew we wanted it to be a qualitative piece of work. The report and a response from the Fair Work Convention are both available online, and I really hope you'll go away and listen, have a read of some of that, because there's such valuable insight in there. It was a piece of work that we decided to concentrate on just 2 sectors in this instance, and interviews with both women and with employers. Now, compared to some of Laura and Wendy's work, it is a relatively modest sample, but the insights have been fantastic just from this relatively small sample of women and workplaces. And NISA have really pulled together such sort of textured and in-depth insights that allow us to see the commonalities between women and the differences. So please do go and have a look and see the quotes and the stories in there. It's really worth a read. I can't go into all of the insights, but here are some of our sort of top level things that stood out to us as we were reading the report. So first of all, just actually the sheer lack of consideration of age within workplaces. So within the sample, none of the employers saw or considered age as a diversity or inclusion priority. So it is a protected characteristic, but it wasn't treated like other protected characteristics. Going back to our first question, is this only a legacy issue? Definitely not, and we've heard why already from Marek and Wendy and Laura. So gendered practices have definitely been experienced by many of the women that we spoke to, but current workplace practices are still having an impact, and this persistence is definitely partly due to current practices. And then here I talk about little effective voice. So we've heard already about conversations not happening in workplaces, and effective voice is one of our dimensions, and it's a really critical dimension actually for fair work. Very few employers were taking time to engage well with this workforce, and if they're not engaging, if they're not listening and acting upon what they're hearing, how do workplaces really begin to understand the real challenges that workplaces are facing? We've heard about the, you know, don't make assumptions, and we completely back that sentiment. Listen to women, talk to women, and open up positive and open conversations, and work with them to design some of the change that needs to happen in workplaces. So NISA also pulled together a series of recommendations directly from the research, and the high-level recommendations are presented here, but again in the report these are broken down into a finer level of detail, so do go and have a look at those. They cover factors from improving awareness, development and delivery of guidelines and various types of support for women and for workplaces, and then on to sort of more practical changes. And so as the Fair Work Convention, we wanted to take all these findings and all these recommendations and try and map them against the Fair Work dimensions in order to create more targeted actions. And this slide first looks to what are the actions we're calling for employers to consider. And you can see they fall across all areas, all our 5 dimensions, and are mirroring a lot of what we've heard coming from other research, both the quantitative and the qualitative from Wendy and Laura. So again, to pick up on effective voice, it's so important that we're having general open conversations, but there were 3 areas of conversation that more specific areas for conversation that women spoke about not having enough of. One was the career management and the career options, and again this is about not making assumptions that women are over 50 are all ready to sort of scale back their career. Yes, some might be, but and that's fine, but others might still be wanting progression at that point. So really being open to both options. We've heard about learning preferences, and it's great to hear that there are some employers making sure teaching and learning is sort of delivered through different medium and different channels, and I think that's something that women in this sample would definitely want. Too much was online, and women really, a number of women in the samples really spoke about needing somebody in front of them to ask a question if they didn't understand what the online portal was telling them or teaching them. So I think that's something. And then retirement, again, we started to hear about retirement, but this was a real challenge. As we've heard, businesses want to understand if people are planning retirement so they can do that sort of backfilling of roles, but we're afraid to have those conversations, and equally the women were afraid to sort of put their hands up and say, yes, actually I am thinking of retiring. So there's a real need for these to be positive and open conversations. Moving on then from effective voice, and I haven't got time to go through all the points on this slide, but happy to take questions about them. But if we look more towards some of the opportunity and security, actually, we talk here about balancing some of those conversations actually with profiling and monitoring. So we're talking partly about pay and the gender pay gap here, so definitely calling for people to be monitoring pay and how age is having an impact on people's pay, and sort of doing that profiling piece. But it shouldn't just stop at pay. We should be thinking about who who is taking up learning opportunities, who is taking up promotion opportunities, and those wider things that happen within workplaces. And I think that links through then to the security point on pay transparency. There was a lot of women in the sample who spoke about perhaps having experienced what they thought was unfair pay, but they didn't have the evidence, and they didn't then have the confidence to question that with employers. Well, if we can encourage businesses to undertake equal pay audits and have that pay transparency set out there, quite quickly some of those challenges are removed. And Laura mentioned menopause. Of course, that came up in these discussions so strongly, and just the sheer impact of the menopause on people's experiences of work. In our response, we're calling for menopause policies within workplaces and mandatory training for line managers. There was definitely a friction where women were managed by younger workers who might never have, well, probably haven't experienced menopause themselves. Perhaps they've heard about family members' experiences, but actually awareness is very limited in terms of what the impacts of menopause is on women and how it affects their work. So I think that point about having mandatory training is one that we'd really like to push forward. So they were looking at actions for employers to take forward, but we've also recognised a role for a number of other stakeholders in the Fair Work Convention's response, and that includes responsibilities or actions guided towards trade unions, for instance, but also policymakers. These sort of go more towards either supporting women or supporting businesses. So picking up, for instance, on that point we were just making about that nervousness about having retirement conversations, and businesses fear that these might seem discriminatory. I think that's yeah, I think more openness about this takes us one step forward, but actually businesses do need support to have some of these conversations, and that's where it's fantastic to see some of the resources that CIPD and others are producing to help businesses have these conversations. I think the challenge is making sure that that advice and those guidelines reach enough businesses, because at the moment, certainly from the sample we were talking to, they weren't all getting to the line managers who needed to hear them. So I think a lot of this is about spreading guidance that already exists and how people access that. So I guess really just to finish, and let's get on to some question and answers, which I'm sure will be really interesting. I think when we're presenting this research from our perspective and from CIPD and Edinburgh Uni Business School, there's so much in here, and there's so much that we could change to ensure women over 50 are having a better experience and a better experience of fair work in their workplaces. And perhaps some of that can seem quite daunting, where to start. But I've taken those points that I'd mapped against the Fair Work dimensions, and when you sort of start putting them in a process like the slides here, actually it becomes more apparent that businesses can start wherever they are now. So let's see it as a process. If businesses don't know the challenges facing this demographic within their workforce, well, let's start having the conversations. And I make the point here, let's stop making the assumptions. So have those conversations, start monitoring and start understanding the issues. And then you design and develop the interventions to tackle those challenges. So this isn't an exhaustive list on the right hand side, but if a business already knows what the challenges are, these are some of the things that it can be doing to change workplace practices and really improve the fair work for women And don't be afraid to take these positive actions. As we said, age is a protected characteristic, so we can take positive actions and tailor interventions and tailor sort of age inclusive processes and policies within our workplaces to ensure things improve for women over 50 and ensure we start reducing that gender pay gap at this older age group. So I'll stop there. Links are here. Happy to share slides, but really would hope that a few people go and have a look at the research report and our response afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for your contributions. They were really interesting. I'm sure everyone will agree. We've not got any questions in the chat yet, so I'm hoping maybe some will come through. We've got about 10-15 minutes for questions just before the end of the session. And we've had some requests for the slides to be shared after the event, so I think all the panelists are happy for me to send those out to all of you, so I'll do that following the session. And also the session has been recorded, so if you want to share with your colleagues as well, I'll send a link to the YouTube once that's up and running as well. But pop your questions in the chat if you have any.
I'm going to ask a question.
Oh, well done, Marek.
I'm going to ask Beth, if I can. What is the next step for the Fair Work Convention and with these findings? Are you approaching employers? Are you going to be lobbying the government for more guidance, or what's the sort of next steps? Because it's a really interesting piece of work and a very interesting area.
Brilliant. Thanks, Marek. Yeah, really good question. Because there are so many actions that we'd like to see going forward. And for some of them, we're not the best person positioned to take those forward. But for some we are. So as I mentioned at the start, for instance, the Fair Work Convention works quite closely with trade unions and various union members within our sort of convention membership group. So it is our intention now to start working with the different stakeholders listed there, for instance, trade unions, and sharing our research findings and really trying to then design how we can start ticking off some of these actions. So we intend, for instance, to speak at some of the trade union with some of the trade union groups. There's women's committees, for instance, that we're organising to meet with, and seeing how that support can be rolled out through to their members. I'm thinking specifically there on things like older women's confidence to go for promotions, or if in the short term recruitment processes aren't going to change, and people are perhaps not very confident going through some of these recruitment processes, what support can be put in place. And I think the trade unions are just one group that can provide some of that support. So we're actually going to formally launch although our research is online already, we're formally launching the research through an event in September, and hope some people will come along to that. But it's quite an involved piece now to think about how we take each point forward. Definitely also working with colleagues in Scottish Government, so that's that's high on our agenda as well.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button there. I've got you on different screens. Thank you, Beth. And we can send details of the Fair Work Convention event with the email that I send out to you all with the slides and the link and everything. So if you are interested in joining that one, I'll send the details on. We've had a question from Alan, so he's asking, I think everyone at the panel, I guess, what would you hope the Scottish Government and Public Health Scotland, for example, could do at a national level to increase awareness of some of the issues in the affecting this age group and bring about improvements to help employers to recruit and retain some of these employees. I'll go to Marek first, just because you're first on my screen, and then you can all have a shot.
I mean, part of the answer is in the question, which is raising awareness, and it's about, I guess, trying to connect the dots between what research tells us about what interventions can actually work and what the outcomes from that are, because there is a lot of research out there, as you have just heard, all of you here, but it needs to actually get to those employers. And it's probably just the same as with almost any other bits of government guidance. It's making sure that signposting works. It's making sure that employers of all sizes are able to access the fact sheets and the sort of guidance that is already out there. I mean, speaking for us as an organization at the CIPD, we've got reams and reams of practical guidance, which is, not just aimed at members, but also freely available online. Now, we do try and give as much of that as we can to the Scottish Government, and some of it is included in certain bits of content. But every time we speak to an employer, they will tell you that the landscape is just so cluttered, they don't really know who to go to. They can speak to Business Gateway if they're a small business, or they can go and speak to Scottish Enterprise, and everybody gives them different advice. Now, that's that's not an easy thing to fix. But what does, of course, help is if we are in times like these, times of crisis, times of, let's say a very tight labor market, and employers start getting a bit more interested in, the well-being of their workers and retention and recruitment. They start looking out for these things. That's the sort of thing that can help as well. So it's a bit of a supply and demand, I guess, question there as well. Not sure that's a very good answer, but I did my best in in pulling this out of thin air. Translating this to public policy asks is difficult. I mean, I'm not going to lie, but it requires the provision and the supply of this guidance to be there, signposting to be there, but also for the demand to be there from the employer side. And we'll let others come in there as well.
Wendy, Laura, you're next on my. Yes, Wendy, you're keen to come in. That's good.
I'll come in, and then Laura, I'm sure we'll have some ideas as well. I think that there's a number of levels, and I think keeping the awareness high is really important. I mean, it's sometimes taken for granted. Marek talked, quite rightly, we're in a very tight labour market, and maybe there is more of a concern, at the moment about, labour shortages. But actually, this is an issue that, I've been researching this area for 20 years, and it's absolutely not gone away. It's becoming more acute. So I think even not just saying it's of the moment and we should think about it because we're all facing labour market shortages at the moment, but this is for a longer term. So keeping that awareness, not been subject to sort of fad and fashion. This is a long-term enduring issue. So I think that's one level, keep that in awareness high and constant. Secondly is by just helping understand the insight and nuance. Just picking up another comment or question in the chat, Laura, you raised about qualitative samples being potentially small. That may be the case for some individual ones, and why I was quite keen to post the the number of studies that we have just been involved in, because collectively they're all endorsing very much similar points, and I think that's important. Yeah. So it's not, if there was just one study of 10 people, but this is a number of studies, in some cases of hundreds of people. I think collectively they really bring together and they endorse that. But I think the advantages of smaller scale qualitative is they can get nuances that the stats can't give us. So for example, not assuming that everybody can work from home, because obviously the reality is there's very different types of employment, people doing different types of jobs, skill levels, home circumstances, precarious nature of work and life, etc. And I think, you know, the Scottish Government Public Health, by funding, you know, work that gives us more of an insight into that, we can really start to bring alive people's experiences and not just end up with you know, reports that talk about people who are maybe the more privileged and tend to get focused on in some types of government policy, really you know, helping us to understand the breadth of experience that we have here. So I think that's the second area that can help. A third area is probably by direct funding of initiatives. So I'm not sure if we've got anybody from Age Scotland here today, but we, along with CIPD, have been working with Age Scotland, for example, who've got an age inclusion matrix. So I'm doing a little bit of a punt for them here. But that work, some of that has been funded, for example, by Scottish Government funding, to be able to work with employers to both do what Beth was talking about, is diagnose what, you know, the issues and challenges are, and then how you overcome them. And there is funding just that's currently started through the Workplace Equality Fund to actually help scale up training and awareness and behavioural change for up to what I think about 1,400 or 1,500 line managers across Scotland. So I think those are a number of different levels that perhaps, you know, with the government and national agencies can really help to make a difference and help support employers who, you know, you're all here because you're interested in this, you know, really do want to do the right thing and try and make work better for older workers. So those would be my punts.
Thanks, Wendy. Laura, Beth, do you have anything to add on this one?
No, I think Wendy's covered everything that I would have said anyway, and more besides. So I'll leave space for other questions.
Just very quickly, I'll pick up on one point that we included in the Ferret Convention's response to the research. That was a very specific policy point. We heard so much in the research about women over 50 not only having to care for elderly parents often and other family members sometimes, but also caring for grandchildren, and this real sort of shift, pull both ways, wanting to support their own children, so you know their own sons and daughters could go out and work full time, but then taking on some of that grandchild care, and really wanting to make sure that that's recognised in policy making. So around you know, early years and childcare policy decision making, actually, is that an audience or you know, a customer base of that policy that's being considered? So you suddenly start to see how many policy areas this reaches out into, and that's part of the challenge, isn't it? So I think yeah, not necessarily always easy, but I think there is more and more awareness within government of this group and the importance of looking at policies across different intersectionality considerations.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that, on the back of that, Beth, and we would really echo that. One of the research projects that we didn't put on that slide was a project that we did looking at grandparents who are combining employment with caring for grandchildren. And that was really, really interesting that these grandparents felt like they really needed to support their children who were often in fairly insecure labour market positions, whereas they themselves as older workers perhaps had more secure employment or were looking to shift to part-time. And this really, really strong sense coming through from older workers that they felt that as, for want of a better term, baby boomers, they perhaps had a little bit more financial security than their adult children did. But even though they were wanting to provide support to their adult children, they still had to negotiate quite carefully flexibility within their own workplaces in order to offer flexibility to their adult children. So I would absolutely agree that there are many, many different policy areas which are relevant to this conversation.
Thank you, everyone. I think that was really interesting insights from you all and answered that question. I think we've got time just for one more question because I don't want the session to run over, and I know that some people are already having to leave. Jeanette just asked about whether we talked about the ageing workforce, and that was mentioned at the beginning. So once we send out the slides and relinks to the report and the recording and everything, hopefully you can catch up and see what was said about that, Jeanette. But we've got a question from Sinead, who's asking if what we're trying to do is encourage employers to adopt better practices with regards to our older workforce, what can be done to change the narrative to make inclusive practices be seen as a solution rather than something else that employers have to do? I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to come in first.
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and you're right, it should be, we sort of need to better demonstrate the win-wins, I suppose, that actually by taking these some of these actions, not only are you making it better for this group of women, but hopefully also the wider workforce. I mean, most of these things, although we're talking about over 50s, better conversations are going to help whatever age you are. So you can start seeing the benefits for the workforce more broadly, but then also the benefits for the business itself. So I mean, I think the most obvious ones are around recruitment and retention costs and those sorts of benefits to a business, that actually you're keeping a loyal workforce by ensuring that they're having a more positive work experience. So maybe that needs better articulating.
Just to add to that very briefly, I think it was Jill Salter earlier in the chat, said about, some of this is not necessarily age specific. Some of it actually just really good HR, like having conversations with people about, career progression plans at regular stages throughout the life course. So I think, the benefits it's not just for a group of people that happen to share, a demographic age. Actually is good at retaining and, having a productive, and Marek talked about productivity right at the very beginning of this presentation, having a more productive workforce.
If I can just come back in on that, I think it all boils down to all the discussions we've been having about job quality more broadly. Why do we focus on job quality? Well, yes, because it's better for individual employees and their well-being, but there's also a business sense there, because we know from all the research that we've been doing for many, many years, the better job quality can lead to better job satisfaction, which then can lead to better individual productivity, which can then lead to better business productivity, which can lead to better country productivity. So, very often that research and that causal link there, I think, needs to be explained a little bit better. I think many of our members, many people, professionals know this already, and they do make that case, but that case needs to be made stronger on the sort of broader employer level as well. But we're doing our bit, and we'll just keep pushing at it as well.
Sorry, I lost my mute button again. Okay, so according to my screen, it's 29 minutes past, so I think we'll just wrap up here. I don't want to run over. It's already been a kind of long session, and I'm thankful for everyone for joining us to hear the contributions. I found it really interesting, so hopefully you did as well. As I said, it's been recorded, and we'll send everything, including slides and every other piece of information we possibly can, out to you over the next couple of days. So yeah, thanks to our panelists, and thanks to you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye-bye.